Now, bass can be a real issue when you're mixing. It can be a real problem because actually 80% of the energy in a sound wave is below 200 hertz. What's 200 hertz? Well, it equates to the G below middle C, or the bottom string of a violin. That is roughly 200 hertz. Everything below that takes 80% of the energy. That's why a bass speaker is bigger, because it's got to shift more air, it's got to do more work. Now, when we're coming to the idea of mixing, we've got to be really careful that there's no bass anywhere that you don't want it to be. Let's have a look. Here then on the screen you can see a track that I recorded. It's actually a reggae version of a Chopin nocturne in B minor. And as you can see, there aren't many tracks, so this is a good one to work on, so it's not huge. Now, it goes like this. So I've got a kick, overhead, a bass, got a Hammond, a guitar, a talk box, and a bit of percussion. That's it. So, if we just have a look at the computer screen here, on the left-hand side you can see each track that is essentially selected. So if I go to bass, for example, you can see that the equalizer here has got a little bit of a lift to give it a bit of depth. Now, what happens with bass, with a bass guitar, is if it doesn't have any mid-range or any treble, you're not going to hear it on any sound system that isn't capable of reproducing it. So when we listen to the radio, when the alarm clock goes off in the morning, the alarm clock's got a speaker that size in it, tiny little speaker, so it can't reproduce anything below, well, 200 or 300 hertz at all. But you can still hear the bass guitar. Why is this? Well, actually, the brain is pretty clever. It listens to the upper harmonics of that bass and then works out what was below it. I know. It's pretty clever stuff, really. So if you have a bass, a sub-bass, for example, you're not going to hear it on a speaker that small. So a Fender Precision, which is what I use most of the time to record, has got a lot of mid-range in it. So if I just play that bass back, there's enough there to latch onto if you can't hear the bass at all. So actually I've cut a lot of the treble here. But it's mostly just for the sort of string and fret noises, just to get rid of that. So the only other thing that should have bass on it in any mix, so you've got your bass guitar or bass sort of synth or whatever, and the kick drum. So if I go to the kick drum here, I've actually put quite a lot of, because it's in front of the drum and there is no hole on the front of the head, I wanted a bit of a click. So there's my kick drum. Everything else, if I go to the overhead, you can see if I open up the EQ, I've rolled off the bass at the end. I've used this bass roll-off control, just to my sort of liking. Of course, your ears are the ultimate judge, and all of this really, when you're judging bass, only works when you're using a really nice pair of speakers. Headphones, to an extent. But, you know, people are listening to this stuff on, you know, a mobile phone or an iPad or a computer. So it's worrying about the bass end, of course. It's important. But ultimately, when people are playing back this stuff, it's on a tiny little phone or an iPad. So there is actually another reason for being efficient with your bass, in that if you have something that's quite loud, if you're playing it through a tiny little speaker, you could get a lot of distortion if the bass is there, if there's lots and lots of bass. Now, people are saying, well, yeah, but if you're playing a violin, there's going to be no bass there anyway. But, well, actually, the microphone records everything. It doesn't select what it records. It records what it hears. And indeed, in a room where there's a sprung floor or there's some sort of bass ambience kicking around, you're going to pick that up. So, for example, if I just go to the guitar part here, I've done the same here. Now, it's just skanked chords. But every time I'm going or sort of tapping the strings, I'm actually generating a lot of bass end. So you may not hear it with one individual instrument, but when you hear all of these little sort of bass blips in other instruments, if you've got lots and lots of tracks, for example, strings, I record a lot of strings. So I basically just sum all of those violin parts to a bus where I cut the bass off. The talk box, I've got like a lead line here. So I've got, as you can see, it's mostly that sort of low bass there. So if I just look, for example, the Wurlitzer. Now, what I tend to do with the contact sounds, for example, they have been programmed and very carefully constructed so that you don't really need to worry too much about the bass because it hasn't been captured by a microphone. So, for example, the Hammond. I have actually cut a lot of the bass here because the Hammond, what you have in reggae is, if I just solo the kick overhead and Hammond only, you have a lot of offbeat semiquavers, offbeat sixteenths. So it's that sort of offbeat stuff. So I've just taken the bass off that so that you get that clear bass drum, but you don't get any bass end from the organ itself. And I've also just taken off the top end so that it's more of a sort of a rhythm rather than a sound in itself. So just going through, just listening through to this with just all the tracks together. If I take the kick and bass away, all the bass end has completely vanished. It's only to be replaced by the bass and the kick. So where do the bass guitar and kick drum, where do they sit then? Well, ideally, the kick drum should have its fundamental frequency underneath that of the bass. Now, the bottom string of a bass guitar, E, is 30-something hertz. It's quite low. But you're not going to get that fundamental frequency. With the bass guitar, especially a precision, you're going to be dealing with the mid-range, so you'll be dealing with harmonics of that note, whereas the resonance of a kick drum could be a lot lower than that. I mean, I just use an 18-inch kick drum here, the Gretsch Catalina kick. So it's not a very big drum, but it actually is there's quite a lot of bass there. So just listening to that kick drum. Okay, there's enough there. So it's about getting that bass drum resonance just to be underneath the bass guitar. So for that really, the 80% of that sound energy at 200 hertz, you want that to be occupied really with the kick drum and the bass guitar, and then just the beginnings of the mid-range of things like guitars and that Hammond organ, for example. So vocals, exactly the same. Anything that is recorded with a microphone, anything you do, just cut really below 100 hertz, for example. That will get rid of a lot of the rumble. Of course, if you've got maybe toms, if you've got a floor tom and you want a load of bass off that, obviously you've got to sort of think about that, sort of include that in your bass guitar and kick drum sort of range. But you can also gate that, because things like ringing toms, if you're just playing the drums and a tom is just ringing there, you could apply a gate to that track so that the tom only sounds when it's hit. The rest of the time, the level from the mic is low enough that the gate actually switches that channel off. But a well-tuned drum kit shouldn't do that anyway. If you've got somebody who's really, really good at tuning drums, basically you shouldn't have that many problems with it. So be careful with bass. It's great to have, of course, but on a sort of a modern, little pair of computer speakers, we've got to think about the fact that things like fundamental, bass synths and stuff aren't really going to come across unless there's some mid-range there. One thing you could do with your bass is to double it, is to have the same line an octave up, if you've programmed it, for example. If you've got a really low bass guitarist, to actually play the line in as well, an octave up, and just mix it a bit in. And then that will just further augment that bass line without you having to try and boost the bass to hear what's going on.